Lee Min-ho was the tiger of Manhattan, a man who ruled through cold steel and modern fear. But tonight, the true power had arrived. His mother, the legendary matriarch of the Lee Syndicate, here to weigh his soul. The air in the club was like ice. Bodyguards with blood on their hands were afraid to even blink. Then a shadow moved. A quiet waitress, a woman the elite treated like furniture, stepped forward. She didn't just serve the matriarch, she bowed low and spoke. It wasn't the polished Korean of the city. It was the raw, ancient Satori of the deep southern coast, a tongue that hadn't been heard in these halls for 50 years. In one sentence, she didn't just break the silence. She shattered the matriarch's heart and brought the tiger's world to a standstill. How does a girl from New York speak the language of the ancestors? And why did her words make the most dangerous woman in Asia weep? Stay with me till the end. This isn't just a story. It's the start of a revolution. Before we begin, like this video, hit subscribe and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's begin. The chandelier light at the Obsidian Club didn't just illuminate the room. It cut through the air like a diamond, polished and cold. In this sanctuary for the city's apex predators, the floor was a stage where fortunes were traded over single malt scotch that cost more than a year of rent. Amara James moved through this world like a shadow cast against a velvet curtain, ever present, yet entirely unseen. She adjusted her white apron, ensuring the knot was perfectly centered. To the men in tailored Italian wool and the women draped in silent couture, Amara was merely a function of the room, like the climate control or the scent of expensive tobacco. She was the hand that replaced a crystal glass before it was empty, the quiet breath that cleared a crumb from a mahogany surface. For 3 years, she had mastered the art of being a ghost. Table 4 needs a refill and don't linger. They're discussing the port merger, the floor manager hissed into her earpiece. Amara didn't nod. She simply flowed toward the station. Her life was a series of calculations. Every step was measured to avoid the gaze of the powerful, every word pruned to a polite, tonal whisper. It was safer that way. In a city that thrived on ego, being nobody was her greatest defense. As she moved between the gilded tables, her mind often drifted far from the clinking of silverware. She thought of the humid, emerald hills of Giala and the grandmother whose voice had been a melody of ancient rhythms and sharp, earthy vowels. Her Halmione had taught her that language was a map of the soul. But in New York, Amara had folded that map and tucked it away in the darkest corner of her heart. She reached for a discarded napkin near a billionaire's elbow, her movements fluid and rhythmic. The man didn't even shift his weight. To him, she was an automated part of the furniture. Amara preferred it. The debt her grandmother had left behind was a heavy shroud, and the only way to shed it was to remain the invisible girl, the one who saw everything and said nothing. But tonight, the air in the Obsidian felt different. The usual hum of greedy ambition had been replaced by a sharp, electric stillness. The heavy oak doors at the entrance creaked open, and for the first time in the history of the club, the elite stopped talking. Amara felt the hair on her arms rise. The ghosts were about to be summoned, and the invisibility she had spent years perfecting was about to be burned away. The heavy, soundproofed doors of the Obsidian didn't just open, they seemed to surrender. Usually, the arrival of a celebrity or a senator sparked a ripple of hushed whispers and the subtle adjustment of ties. But as the two figures crossed the threshold, the silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum that sucked the oxygen right out of the room. Lee Min-ho walked in first, moving with the predatory grace of a man who owned the shadows he cast. His gray suit was sharp enough to draw blood, paired with a black turtleneck that made his features look like they were carved from pale stone. He didn't look at the room. He surveyed it, his dark eyes scanning for threats with a cold, clinical detachment. He was the tiger of the underworld, the man whose name was a death sentence whispered in the dark. But even the tiger walked a half-step behind the woman at his side. Sung Kyung moved with a terrifying, upright stillness. Her silver-gray hair was swept back into a style that was both elegant and severe, framing a face that had seen empires rise and fall without losing its composure. She wore a dark, tailored suit that whispered of old money and older blood. She didn't need to shout to be heard. Her power was an atmospheric pressure that made the wealthiest men in Manhattan feel suddenly, desperately small. Amara stood frozen near the service station, her fingers tightening around a silver tray. She had seen power before, but this was different. This was ancestral. This was the kind of authority that didn't come from bank accounts, but from a lineage of iron. As the pair moved toward the center of the room, the floor manager bowed so low he nearly doubled over, his usual arrogance evaporating into a frantic desire to please. The elite patrons, the billionaires who usually barked orders, suddenly found great interest in the bottom of their glasses, unwilling to lock eyes with the matriarch. Minho pulled out a chair at the most secluded table in the room, table 7, with a sharp, decisive snap of wood against the floor. Every movement he made was a warning. Sung Kyung sat, her posture as straight as a blade, her eyes remaining fixed forward as if she were looking through the walls of the club toward a distant horizon. Amara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that felt dangerously loud in the oppressive quiet. She knew the protocol. She knew she should move, should offer the water, should perform the dance of the invisible servant. But as she looked at the back of the matriarch's head, a phantom scent of pine needles and sea salt filled her mind, a memory of a home she thought she had buried. The tiger and the queen had arrived, and for Amara, the world was about to narrow down to a single, terrifying choice. The silence at table 7 was a physical weight, heavy and suffocating. Amara approached with the practiced lightness of a ghost, her pulse thrumming in her fingertips as she reached for the heavy crystal decanter. She could feel Minho's gaze before she even looked up, a sharp, jagged heat that felt like a blade pressed against her throat. He was vibrating with a restless, dark energy, his fingers drumming a rapid, impatient tattoo against the white linen cloth. Beside him, Sung Kyung remained a statue of jade, her silence demanding a perfection that the air in the room seemed too thin to provide. As Amara leaned in to pour the water, her hand, usually as steady as the stone floors of the club, betrayed her with a microscopic tremor. A single, solitary drop of water escaped the rim of the glass, landing on the polished mahogany table with the force of a thunderclap in the absolute quiet. Minho's hand shot out, slamming onto the table. The silver clattered, and several guests at nearby tables flinched, their eyes darting away in a collective panic. "Is this the best this city has to offer?" Minho's voice was a low, dangerous rasp, dripping with a contempt that made the floor manager turn pale. He turned his head slowly toward Amara, his eyes narrowing into slits of pure obsidian. "You move like a corpse. Do you think my mother has all night to wait for a simple glass of water, or are you just as vacant as you look?" Amara kept her head bowed, her eyes fixed on the spilled drop of water. "I apologize, sir. It won't happen again." "Apologies are for the weak," Minho snapped, his frustration boiling over. He had been pushed all day by rivals and red tape, and now, the sight of this quiet, unassuming waitress seemed to represent everything he hated about the slow, soft world he was forced to navigate. "You're an eyesore. Slow, clumsy, and useless. If you can't even perform the basic duties of a servant, why are you breathing the air in this room? Get out of my sight before I decide to make your disappearance permanent." The insult wasn't just a critique, it was an erasure. He spoke to her as if she were less than the dust on his boots. Amara felt the familiar sting of the invisible girl complex, the urge to shrink until she vanished entirely. But then, she caught the slightest flicker of movement from Sung Kyung. The matriarch hadn't moved her head, but her eyes had shifted, watching Amara with a cold, piercing curiosity. The air in the room grew even colder. Amara realized that if she left now, she would remain a ghost forever. But the words of her grandmother stirred in her gut, a defiant, ancient pride that refused to be buried under a billionaire's boot. The tiger had bared his teeth, but he didn't realize he was standing in the presence of someone who knew the old songs of the hunt. The air was thick with Minho's venom, a lethal silence stretching as the elite patrons held their breath, waiting for the waitress to vanish into the shadows of the service hall. Amara felt the weight of the matriarch's gaze, a stare that didn't just see her uniform, but searched for the soul beneath it. The insults from the tiger still echoed, sharp and ugly, but they were drowned out by a different sound in Amara's mind, the rhythmic crashing of waves against the jagged rocks of the Giala coast. Amara didn't retreat. She didn't tremble. Instead, she set the decanter down with a deliberate, soft click. She straightened her spine, her posture suddenly mirroring the regal rigidity of the woman seated before her. When she spoke, it wasn't the submissive, airy English of a Manhattan servant. "Gwinchin sumnida iamioni," she began, her voice dropping into a register that was deep, earthy, and thick with the honeyed gravity of the southern hills. "Suziro dunun barami jayal bado boda misiopnio, jam suio gasij, tatutin chahan jan alyodo dogitsumnika." The words were satori, not the popularized dialect found in dramas, but a rare, archaic Gialadu tongue, flavored with the salt of the earth and the dignity of a century gone by. It was the language of grandmothers who hauled oyster nets by hand and linguists who studied the breath of the mountains. The effect was instantaneous. It was as if a physical shockwave had rippled through the table. Minho's hand, still resting on the table, froze. His mouth opened slightly, the sharp retort he had been preparing dying in his throat. He looked at Amara not as a nuisance, but as a ghost that had suddenly gained flesh and bone. But it was Sung Kyung who truly transformed. The matriarch's iron composure shattered. Her eyes, once as cold as polished jade, widened until they shimmered with a sudden, overwhelming moisture. Her breath hitched, a jagged sound that betrayed decades of suppressed longing. To her, this wasn't just a greeting. It was the sound of the soil she had been born on, a voice from a home that had been sanitized and stripped away by the cold, modern empire her son now led. The room was no longer just silent, it was paralyzed. The invisible girl had spoken in the tongue of the queen's childhood, a dialect so specific it carried the scent of pine needles and wood smoke. Sung Kyung reached out, her hand trembling as she touched the edge of Amara's white apron. "Neo," the matriarch whispered, her voice cracking for the first time in 40 years. "How do you have the voice of my mother?" The tiger's world had been brought to a standstill by 5 words, and for the first time in her life, Amara James was no longer a shadow. She was the only light in the room. The floor manager took a frantic step forward, his face a mask of panicked servility. He reached for Amara's arm, his fingers twitching to pull her away before this bizarre cultural glitch could further offend his most dangerous guests. "I am so incredibly sorry, madame," he stammered, his voice thin and reedy. "She's clearly confused. Amara, get back to the kitchen immediately." "Touch her," Sung Kyung said, her voice a low, vibrating hum of pure authority, "and you will lose the hand that does it." The manager froze as if struck by lightning, his arm suspended in midair. The silence in the room deepened, turning from a vacuum into a heavy, suffocating shroud. Sung Kyung ignored him entirely. Her focus was absolute, her wet eyes locked onto Amara with a desperate intensity that bordered on reverence. The matriarch nudged the heavy mahogany chair beside her, a seat reserved for advisors, generals, and blood relatives. "Sit," she commanded. It wasn't a request, it was an elevation. "Mother," Minho hissed, his voice a mixture of shock and burgeoning fury. He looked between the black woman in the servant's apron and his mother's tear-stained face. "This is a waitress. We are in the middle of—" "We are in the middle of a desert," Sung Kyung interrupted, her gaze finally snapping toward her son. "And this girl just brought me water from the well I thought had run dry 40 years ago." She turned back to Amara, her expression softening into something achingly human. "Sit down, child. Tell me of the woman who gave you that voice. Tell me of the hills where the pines grow crooked against the wind." Amara felt the eyes of the entire club boring into her back. The staff stood paralyzed in the shadows, their mouths agape at the sight of an invisible girl being invited into the inner sanctum of the Lee dynasty. To sit was to break every rule of her survival. It was to step out of the shadows and into a spotlight that could just as easily burn as it could warm. She looked at Minho. His eyes were dark, swirling with a dangerous blend of confusion and resentment. Then she looked at Sung Kyung, whose hand was still trembling near Amara's sleeve, waiting for a connection to a home she had lost. Amara slowly reached back and untied the knot of her white apron. She draped the fabric over a side station, revealing the simple black dress beneath. With a steady breath, she pulled the heavy chair out and sat. The wood groaned under the weight of the shift in power. At table 7, the hierarchy of the city had been dismantled. A waitress was no longer serving the queen, she was being claimed by her. The transition was as jarring as it was dangerous. Though she sat at the matriarch's side, the theater of the night demanded she maintain her utility. Under the guise of pouring a rare vintage for Minho's top advisors, 3 men who had slithered to the table like vultures sensing a change in the wind, Amara leaned into the periphery of their conversation. These men, dressed in charcoal silks with predatory smiles, barely glanced at her. To them, she was merely a new pet the matriarch had plucked from the dirt, a novelty that would soon be discarded. They spoke in a clipped, rapid-fire Korean, peppered with a gritty, modern Seoul street slang. It was a jagged dialect of the underworld, designed to bypass the ears of the old guard, represented by Sung Kyung. They thought they were speaking in a vacuum, shielded by Amara's skin color and her supposed rural ignorance. They were wrong. The shipment is moved to the pier. The old hen won't see the deficit until the books are burned, whispered the man to Minho's right, a snake-eyed lieutenant named Park. He used the term *K-kakjugi*, a slang for a specific type of crooked accounting, hidden beneath a laugh as he toasted to Minho's health. Amara's hand remained steady as she filled Park's glass, but her mind was racing. Her grandmother hadn't just taught her the high satori of the mountains. She had raised Amara on the history of the streets, explaining how the language of the desperate evolved to hide crime. She recognized the market talk instantly. They weren't just discussing business, they were discussing a hollowed-out empire. "The tiger's claws are being clipped tonight," the second man muttered, leaning in under the cover of the clinking silverware. He used a specific, archaic term for poisoning the well, a metaphor for a coup. "By the time the sun rises, the boy will be a king with no gold, and the mother will be a memory." The betrayal was thick in the air, a foul stench hidden behind the aroma of truffle and expensive wine. They were mocking Minho to his face while feigning loyalty to his mother, convinced that their coated tongue was an impenetrable fortress. They viewed Amara as a bridge to the past, a sentimental distraction for an old woman. They didn't realize she was a bridge to their executioner. Beside her, Sung Kyung was smiling, her hand resting warmly on Amara's arm, lost in the joy of the dialect they had shared. She was vulnerable in her happiness, her guard lowered by the sound of home. Amara looked at Minho, who was nodding at Park's lies, oblivious to the knife being sharpened beneath the table. The invisible girl was the only one who could hear the sharpening of the blade. The dinner service drifted into a tense, secondary phase as the vultures excused themselves to the lounge, leaving a pocket of suffocating silence at table 7. Minho stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor like a serrated blade. He didn't look at his mother. His eyes were fixed on Amara with a dark, predatory curiosity. "The air is too thin in here," Minho rasped. "Waitress, walk with me. My mother needs a moment to compose her spirit, and I need to understand exactly what kind of creature has crawled into our confidence." Sung Kyung squeezed Amara's wrist, a silent, protective gesture, but Amara knew she couldn't hide behind the matriarch forever. She stood and followed the tiger into the dimly lit corridor of the wine cellar, where the temperature dropped and the hum of the club faded into a tomb-like quiet. Minho spun around, pinning her against a rack of century-old Bordeaux. He didn't use his hands, but his presence was a physical weight. "You have my mother weeping over the soil of a village she hasn't seen in decades," he hissed, leaning in until Amara could smell the sharp tang of his expensive scotch. "But I don't believe in coincidences. I believe in plants. I believe in spies who use sentiment as a silencer." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a heavy, black-framed burner phone. He thumbed the screen, revealing a series of encrypted messages, the very same market talk Amara had overheard at the table. "My lieutenants think they are clever, but I know there is a rot in my house," Minho said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "I saw your eyes when they spoke. You understood them. Now you have a choice. You tell me exactly what you heard, and you risk Park and his men finding out you're the rat. They will find you. They will find anyone you've ever loved. Or," he stepped closer, his shadow swallowing her whole, "you keep your mouth shut, stay invisible, and I hand you over to them myself as a peace offering to prove my loyalty to the board." He was testing the alloy of her soul. He was asking her to choose between the safety of her anonymity and the life-shattering danger of the truth. "If you speak, you lose your life as a ghost. If you don't, you lose your life tonight," Minho challenged, his eyes searching hers for a flicker of fear. "Who are you, Amara James? A daughter of Giala or just another scavenger looking for a way out?" Amara looked at the phone, then up into the cold, desperate eyes of a king who knew his throne was burning. The invisibility she had worn like armor for 3 years felt suddenly like a shroud. To save the woman who had heard her grandmother's voice, she had to stop being a ghost and start being a target. Amara did not blink. The cold steel of the wine cellar seemed to seep into her bones, but she met Minho's gaze with a clarity that finally matched his own. "A scavenger looks for an exit," she said, her voice steady and low. "A daughter stays to defend the hearth. Your lieutenants aren't just skimming the gold, Minho. They're burning the maps." She began to translate. She didn't just give him the words. She gave him the context, the nuances of the market talk that revealed a systematic dismantling of his family's logistics. She explained that the K-Kakjugi wasn't about missing cash, but about diverted weapon shipments and compromised safe houses. By the time she finished, Minho's face had shifted from suspicion to a grim, terrifying realization. They returned to the dining room, but the dynamic had shifted. Amara was no longer sitting as a guest. She stood behind Sung Kyung, positioned like a silent guardian. To the vultures in the lounge, she appeared to have been put back in her place. In reality, she was now the most dangerous person in the room. As the advisors returned to the table to finalize the night's business, Amara practiced the Giala ear. While she refilled tea and adjusted silk napkins, she filtered every cough, every side-eye, and every whispered syllable of slang. Sung Kyung, clued in by a single, sharp look from her son, played her part perfectly. The matriarch acted the role of the nostalgic elder, leaning on Amara for translations of menu items, which were actually coded reports. "The tea is a bit bitter, isn't it, child?" Sung Kyung asked, her voice light. "It's the harvest, Iamioni," Amara replied in the deep dialect. "The roots were poisoned before the bloom. The man to your left has the salt in his pocket." Amara had uncovered the depth of the rot. It wasn't just embezzlement. Park had already coordinated with a rival syndicate to strike at the Lee estate at dawn. The old hen and the tiger were to be gift-wrapped for their enemies. Every time Park laughed at one of Minho's jokes, Amara heard the sound of a shovel hitting dirt. She felt the weight of the secrets pressing against her ribs. She was the shadow translator, a bridge between a dying tradition and a murderous future. The vultures thought they were playing a game of chess against a fatting queen and a reckless king, never imagining that the girl holding the teapot was the one who could see the entire board. The private banquet hall of the Obsidian had been transformed into a courtroom of shadows. 12 chairs surrounded a table of black obsidian, each occupied by a regional director of the Lee Syndicate. At the head sat Minho, his face a mask of granite, and beside him, Sung Kyung, whose presence was the only thing holding the fractured room together. Amara stood 3 paces behind them, her hands clasped, her eyes downcast in the posture of a servant. To the directors, she was a piece of the architecture. To the Lees, she was their only lifeline. The air was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and impending treason. Park stood, his voice smooth and dripping with a counterfeit concern that turned Amara's stomach. "The numbers do not lie, Chairman," Park said, addressing Minho while looking at the board. "The losses in the southern ports are catastrophic. It is clear that the modern world has outpaced your leadership. For the survival of the family, we must vote on a transition of power. Tonight." A low murmur of agreement rippled through the room. The vultures were ready to strike. The vote was a formality. The knives were already unsheathed beneath the table. Minho's hand tightened into a white-knuckled fist. He looked at the board, seeing the faces of men he had enriched, now waiting to feast on his remains. He glanced back at Amara. It was the signal. Amara stepped forward, breaking the sacred line of the inner circle. The directors bristled, their eyes flashing with indignation. "Who let this girl speak?" one snarled. "This is a meeting of blood, not service." Amara ignored him, her voice rising in the sharp, rhythmic cadence of the Giala Mountains, a sound so jarring and out of place in this modern den of thieves that it commanded a sudden, startled silence. The blood at this table is diluted with salt, she declared, her eyes locking onto Park. She began to recount the market talk she had intercepted, but this time she didn't just translate, she exposed. She detailed the exact pier where the diverted shipments sat and the specific offshore accounts where the deficit was being hidden. But the final blow was the slang. You spoke of the night of the long knives in the tongue of the docks, Amara said, her voice like a ringing bell. You told your brothers that the tiger was toothless and the queen was a memory. But you forgot one thing, Mr. Park. The language of the ancestors doesn't just hold memories, it holds the truth. She reached into her apron and pulled out the burner phone Minho had given her, sliding it across the black stone table. It was loaded with the recordings she had helped decipher. The color drained from Park's face. The board members, sensing the shift in the wind, recoiled from him as if he were a leper. The coup hadn't even begun, and it was already dead. Amara stood tall, the invisible girl finally casting a shadow that covered the entire room. She had spoken for the boss, and in doing so, she had rewritten the fate of the dynasty. The silence that followed Amara's revelation was more terrifying than the shouting that preceded it. It was the silence of a tomb being sealed. Park reached for the burner phone, his hand trembling, but Minho's hand was faster, pinning the traitor's wrist to the obsidian table with a sickening crack. Minho didn't yell. He didn't need to. He looked at the board members. His eyes as cold as a winter morning in the mountains. My mother told me that we had lost our way, he said softly, his voice echoing in the hollow room. She said we had replaced honor with mathematics. I didn't believe her. I thought the old ways were dead. He turned his gaze to Park, whose face was now a sickly shade of gray. But it turns out the only one in this room who knows the meaning of loyalty is a woman you didn't even think was worth a glance. At a sharp nod from Minho, the heavy doors of the banquet hall groaned open. The tiger's personal guard, men who had remained loyal to the matriarch's bloodline, entered like shadows. There was no struggle. The traitors were removed with a clinical, terrifying efficiency, their pleas for mercy dying in the hallway. The rot had been excised, not by a blade, but by a voice. When the doors clicked shut again, only Minho, Sung Kyung, and Amara remained. The adrenaline that had sustained Amara began to ebb, leaving her lightheaded and raw. She moved to step back into her corner, to return to the safety of the shadows, but Minho stood and blocked her path. He looked at her then, not as a waitress, not as a tool, and not as a curiosity. For the first time, he looked at her as an equal. He reached out, and for a fleeting moment, Amara thought he might strike her for knowing too much. Instead, he bowed. It wasn't a shallow gesture of politeness. It was the deep, respectful bow of a warrior acknowledging a superior. I spent my life looking for snakes in the grass, Minho admitted, his voice thick with a rare humility. I never thought to look for the one person standing right in front of me who held the key to my survival. Sung Kyung approached them, her silver hair shimmering under the chandeliers. She took Amara's hands in hers, her palms warm and steady. Blood makes you related, the matriarch whispered in that deep, comforting Giala dialect. But honor makes you family. You saved my son's life and you saved my heart. Amara looked from the matriarch to the tiger. The debt that had weighed her down for years felt suddenly light. She was no longer a ghost haunting a high-end club. She was the foundation upon which a new empire would be built. In a world of porcelain smiles and hidden knives, she was the only truth left standing. The Obsidian Club appeared exactly as it always had, a fortress of glass and granite glowing under the amber streetlights of Manhattan. But for Amara, the world had shifted on its axis. As she stepped through the heavy oak doors for the final time, she wasn't wearing the white apron or the sensible black shoes of a servant. She wore a long, tailored coat of midnight wool, a gift from Sung Kyung, and her hair was pinned back in a neat, elegant bun that no longer felt like a mask. The staff, the very people who had ignored her for 3 years, stood in a silent line near the foyer. They didn't look at her with pity or indifference anymore. They looked at her with a profound, trembling awe. The floor manager, the man who had once tried to pull her away from the table, lowered his head so deeply his chin touched his chest as she passed. Amara didn't gloat. She simply walked past them with the quiet, centered grace of someone who finally knew exactly who she was. Waiting at the curb was a fleet of 3 black SUVs, their engines humming in a low, synchronized growl. A driver in a crisp black suit stood by the door of the center vehicle, his hand already on the handle. As Amara approached, he bowed, a gesture not for a passenger, but for a sovereign. Inside the darkened cabin, the air smelled of expensive leather and the faint, comforting scent of pine needles. Sung Kyung sat in the back, her eyes closed, looking more at peace than Amara had ever seen her. Next to her, Minho was on a secure line, his voice sharp and decisive as he issued orders to rebuild the ports. When he saw Amara, he paused. He didn't finish the sentence. He simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement that every move he made from this moment on would be filtered through her counsel. As the SUV pulled away from the curb, Amara looked out the tinted window at the blurring lights of the city. She was still the invisible girl, in a way. The public would never know her name, and the tabloids would never capture her face. She would remain in the shadows, a ghost in the machinery of the city's most powerful dynasty. But she was no longer hiding from the world. She was watching over it. She reached into her pocket and felt the small, wooden prayer beads her grandmother had left her. She had been a waitress, a translator, and a target. Now she was the bridge between the old world and the new, the secret hand of the matriarch. As the car sped into the heart of the night, Amara James finally let out a long, slow breath. The debt was paid, the voice was found, and the tiger finally had a heart. Thanks for watching, and remember to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss interesting stories like this. See you in the next story.